By improving the ESG profile of their portfolios and aligning their capital allocation decisions with the Paris Agreement, investors are in a very powerful position to facilitate positive change, all while giving themselves a competitive advantage in market. A recent report, Values to Riches by the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia, showed us that consumers expect their bank account and super funds to be invested responsibly and ethically and have a positive impact on the world with climate change top of mind. But at the same time, consumers are demanding transparency and are attuned to the threat of greenwashing. All of this ultimately poses a problem for investors today. How can they, hand on heart, accurately communicate to their consumers that they're taking real action on climate change? Positively, there have been recent innovations in technology that support the investment community as they navigate this challenge. We're seeing a major shift in how seriously the investment community is taking their climate-related risks and responsibilities. And one of the biggest drivers is this growing trend in consumer awareness.
So our research shows us there's really been a step change in the expectations of Australians, that they do expect very clearly super funds and banks take strong action on climate change. Consumers want to know that their investments are being managed in a way that is aligned to the Paris Agreement and net zero by 2050. And that means they want to see changes in their portfolio. They want to see actual reductions in emissions. They want to see investors driving change in the companies to align those to that long-term net zero and to drive the transition through the companies they're investing in. What we see here in Australia is a trend we're seeing mirrored in the major markets around the world, from North America, Europe, UK. We again see really strong uptake of commitments by investment organisations to net zero emissions, but equally this really strong rising consumer sentiment expecting investors to take stronger action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
But consumers are also demanding transparency from their providers and are increasingly aware of the threat of greenwashing. This is the misrepresentation of a financial product as having greater social or environmental credentials than it actually possesses.
So what's become really clear is greenwashing is now a concern from consumers. We saw 75% of Australians telling us they're concerned about the claims being made from banks and financial institutions. This tells me, in fact, our consumers are getting much more astute. They're paying attention and they're looking to differentiate the credible commitments and the credible action on climate change from that that's less credible. Today, it's no longer sufficient solely to have a net zero commitment. Very quickly, consumers are scrutinising those commitments to understand they're actually driving change in line with the Paris Agreement and actually driving emissions reductions. So it's really important that investors can evidence and substantiate that they're moving towards net zero, not in the 2040s, but in the 2020s now. So consumers are expecting to see action and expecting to see integrity in the reporting and the emissions that underpin the evidence to drive that action.
But in reality, greenwashing can be very difficult to avoid, which is why we often refer to it as unintentional greenwashing.
So the question is, why is it hard for investment managers to communicate on this subject? And it's really tricky because you may be working with the notion of climate-related financial risk. You may be thinking about that massive decarbonisation trend and how that's going to impact your portfolio. But when it comes to commitments and public communication, are you talking about your emissions? Are you talking about gross emissions, net zero emissions, climate neutral, carbon neutral? It's a minefield to actually be communicating this. So creating that consistent framework of reporting, ultimately regulatory reporting, is going to be so important to instill confidence in consumers about how we talk about this issue. This is an interesting point because in the EU, that's where the conversation has begun. Before regulation, it's just simply, let's just work out a terminology here under the EU taxonomy that defines what these different things are so that we can work out what people should or shouldn't be saying.
And even when investors do get the terminology right, there can be varying degrees of quality in the carbon information that's being disclosed. In essence, it's difficult to know, especially on a portfolio level, if public statements are based on potentially incorrect data. Positively, there have been recent innovations in technology that hold promise for addressing this problem.
So as a financial institution, you're looking to, firstly for yourself, understand what's really going on in these portfolios. And then once you've set your plans in place, you're trying to demonstrate to your members, to your users, how that's going. And if you don't understand the integrity of that information, or if you're uncertain about it, well, that just flows through to anyone who's then using that information downstream from there. Very helpfully, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has set out the principles of good carbon disclosure. And these say that this information has to be relevant to the user, this information has to be accurate, it has to be complete, we have to have a consistent approach, and it has to be transparent about how that was arrived at. And if we follow those principles, we should be able to provide carbon disclosure that's really useful for the user. In terms of accuracy, if you look below the hood of these calculations, you're really talking about capturing some information about an activity that a business is doing. You know, how many kilometers did this truck travel, for example? And you're taking that and you're plugging it into a model that says, well, where is this truck? And what kind of fuel does this truck run on? And how far does it generally drive? What's the weather like in certain circumstances? You're taking all that information, all those inputs, and you're creating a model that can actually then say it's produced an estimate of 23 tons of CO2 equivalent. So technology really plays a great part in being able to pull that information together, put it into a model consistently, and perform this accurate calculation that you can revisit afterwards to ensure that was accurate and it was done on the best information available at the time. In terms of transparency, the ability for communication to be sent from one part to another part is something that technology does really, really well. Sending spreadsheets between people is difficult, and collating them is difficult. But once you've set up a protocol for how a technology can communicate, it really enables you to aggregate information in a consistent way that then creates the transparency across a portfolio that's required in this particular circumstance.
As businesses all across the world start to understand about their responsibilities when it comes to climate action, you start to realise that it's very hard to keep up with the demands of servicing all of these companies through human capital, through environmental consultants, which is what's been happening for the last 20 years. Technology can then play a really important role in ensuring that we can transform the way we measure carbon emissions and therefore apply climate action for every single one of these companies in a very consistent manner. When you do that, there's far less errors, far more consistency, the data is far more structured, it's easier to understand, it's probably going to conform to a standard all across the world. And all of that combined will result in far less greenwashing, intentional or otherwise.
As much as Australians expect that their investments are managed in a way that avoids the worst impacts of climate change, they actually tell us that they're really excited to invest in those opportunities that will come from transitioning to a low carbon economy, investing in renewable energy, electrification of transport, water efficiency technologies. So there's a lot here to be gained by those investments in the opportunities that will present themselves as we transition our economy to net zero by 2050.
Through technology, we have an opportunity to support investors in accurately communicating their carbon-related claims. Not only will they be able to feel more confident about the transparency they're creating for their consumers, they can truly start celebrating the work they're doing in relation to climate change, deliver on their fiduciary responsibility to manage climate risk, and ultimately exercise their positive influence on our race to zero emissions.
You cannot get to the scale that we need to get to as humanity to fix climate change without technology. It just simply can't happen. Human beings cannot. I don't think that we can keep up. Even if you bring all the consultants in the world, I don't think we can keep up with the reporting needs for measuring carbon emissions.